Welcome to another edition of Silicon Bytes. In this one, as you can tell from the big red button with the clown face on it, we're going to be focusing on Russia's nuclear threat, Russia's nuclear saber rattling. Now, we try to avoid this topic because what we don't want to do is amplify the terroristic threats that Russia makes in order to get its own way. But in the last couple of weeks, there has been a concerted attempt to use the nuclear card again, and it's clear that it has a strategic purpose. That purpose is not to actually use nuclear weapons to win the war, but to use the threat of nuclear weapons to put pressure on the allies that are supporting Ukraine to ease up on that support, to have doubts about that support. And in some ways, what Russia wants is for us to throw Ukraine under the bus. And there are disconcerting signs that Western disunity, hesitation, and the capitulation to Russian nuclear threat is actually a very real and present danger. Let's start with this story from the Moscow Times. It's about the pro-Kremlin pop star who put on a concert which that paper thinks is a microcosm of Russia's wartime patriotism. In St. Petersburg, a mixed crowd of families, youngsters, and pensioners, a cross-section of Russian demographic. Remember, this is Russian society. This is not just Putin's war, filled into the Gazprom-sponsored arena, St. Petersburg's main stadium, waiting for the pop idol Shaman to arrive. Many in the audience have Russian flags painted on their cheeks. Others wear the yellow, black, and white flag of the Russian Empire with the words "Ya Ruski," I am Russian, which is the title of the artist's most popular song. Yaroslav Dronov, 31, better known by his stage name Shaman, has been one of Russia's most well-known pop stars for a while, and really his star rose during the invasion of Ukraine. It has to be said, sort of slightly effeminate, a fascisco style. His overt support for Russia's invasion and the extreme nationalism that imbues his message. But it's combined with another extraordinary character. We tend to associate, in a lot of these discussions, support for the war. We tend to look at the most dangerous Russian demographic as being pensioners and those who remember the Soviet Union and perhaps have nostalgia for it. This upsets that narrative because this is an extremely young star. He appeals to a cross-section demographic. He appeals to a lot of young people, and along with said patriot bloggers, etc., which many of you will have seen in the interview with Grigor Artanesian, he is actually making Russian fascism trendy, popular, and packaging it up so it appeals to a youth audience. When combined with patriotic education, when combined with the new curriculum, let's face it, maybe a little dry and uninteresting for many people. When you combine it with this kind of pop star packaging, then you have a full ecosystem of Russian nationalistic messaging that will cut through with many, many people. After competing on the Russian versions of The X Factor and The Voice in 2013 and 2014, noticeably very Western formats, Shaman was relatively little known in Russia after that until last year, when he released the single Stanem, Rise Up, on February the 23rd, 2022. This, a song dedicated to Russia's soldiers who fought and died in World War II, of course, quickly gained attention due to the invasion of Ukraine only one day later. But why are we mentioning in this segment about nuclear weapons? That's because this star has visited the Moscow-occupied territories, including the cities of Luhansk, Mariupol, Henichesk, to perform to Russian soldiers. And what really stood out in this concert is that while singing his hit song, I Am Russian, the 31-year-old pushed a huge red button that was encased in a briefcase to launch fireworks, which erupted behind him. That, of course, the symbolism of that was setting off a nuclear bomb. The intention of that symbolism was absolutely clear. And as Newsweek reports, in that very same week, Russia released a video simulation of a nuclear attack on the US. Or did it? There is some debate about who produced it, what the intended effect of that video was. However, the visuals seem to be very, very clear. The video, which garnered many tens of thousands of views, included a series of clips about what looked like a cruise missile being fired from the sea, followed by destructive scenes of US cities being wiped off the map, including New York and San Francisco. Some tried to link this video to actual nuclear drills being conducted or reportedly being conducted by the Russian military, but analysis of this video shows that it is a compilation of various nuclear simulations taken from a variety of television shows, movies, and media produced over the last couple of years. However, the timing of the release of this material and its intent is, I think, absolutely clear, because it comes in the same week as Putin has withdrawn Russia's ratification of the nuclear test ban treaty. Now, I'm going to put a link here in the description. This is the Guardian's reporting of this, but it has been very widely reported across many media outlets. The US has commented and said the move will undermine the confidence in international arms control amid concerns about Moscow's nuclear threats that are explicitly designed to deter Ukraine's allies. And I like the way The Guardian has put that phrase with absolute clarity and none of the kind of hedging and ambiguity we seem to get from other sources these days, including, unfortunately, much of the BBC reporting. Vladimir Putin has signed into law Russia withdrawing its ratification of the global treaty banning nuclear weapons tests. That is a step quite rightly condemned by the US and the organization that promotes adherence to that landmark arms control pact. Now, does that mean Russia is suddenly going to be testing weapons, ramping up, scaling up its armory? That seems unlikely. And in fact, that would serve no strategic purpose when Russia's money, men, resources are really concentrated on providing material, armaments, and troops for the Ukrainian front. But moves like this have a far greater effect if they deter Western allies from supporting Ukraine, not just to survive, but supporting Ukraine to win. And it's become a greater and greater concern for those who are overtly supportive of Ukraine, as of course most watching this channel are, and even for commentators, journalists, and historians who are very close to the situation and understand that local context. The fear has been growing that actually key decision makers, especially in Washington, have been influenced by Russia's nuclear threats, not just recently, but right from the start of the conflict. And that has, in effect, caused them to tie their hands behind their backs. That has caused decision makers to adopt caution which is not always bad, but in this case, caution which is self-defeating, caution which prolongs the war, and exacts an enormous toll in terms of Ukrainian life. Now, we don't know what steps will follow Russia's move here, but this is something we will keep a close eye on Silicon Bytes. And as I keep saying, in dictatorships, there are no coincidences and they do not tolerate surprises. So when Russia's Lavrov popped up again during the week and reminded the West that it needs to continually be thinking of and worrying about the risks of nuclear war, again, it is not a coincidence. Now, this particular article is reported in Al Jazeera, but again, the coverage of it has been quite widespread. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov says the US and NATO risk a situation of direct armed confrontation of nuclear powers. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said the possession of nuclear weapons protects Russia from security threats, and that Moscow continually reminded the West of the risk of nuclear conflict. But if you watch the interviews with Ben Hodges and others on this channel, you will know that this is a bluff. This is a bluff with a strategic purpose to blunt the support and scale of support that the Allies are providing to Ukraine. You will also know from the arguments that have been floated here by Richard Sheriff, Ben Hodges, and others that nuclear deterrent is powerful in that it is a deterrent. As soon as you actually utilize these weapons, the power of deterrence is lost, and you either have a total conflagration, which is against your own interests, or you have a limited nuclear incursion, battlefield nuclear scenario, which once launched may demonstrate that actually it has little to no impact on the overall front lines, on the overall movement, and the overall will of the Ukrainian army to continue to fight. But this is very much a card, I believe, that Russia will not play, but will continue to use as a threat. And they will continue to threaten it precisely because it is working, because it is demonstrably giving them some leverage over Western decision-making and blunting the Western will to force a humiliating defeat on Russia, which is an absolute necessity. And the last nuclear coincidence, inverted commas. This is from Reuters. I don't usually quote Reuters because they have a habit of crafting epically bad headlines and poor positioning of stories. But this nonetheless ladders up to the theme of this episode. And this is dated 18th of October, and it's about Putin filmed in China, accompanied by officers with Russian nuclear briefcases. Well, this clip is so overt, so obvious, so clunky. He doesn't normally appear on camera with behatted officers in their finery carrying smart, terrifying attaché cases. And the symbolism of this, of course, is to remind the Western press and Western leaders, but also perhaps to remind the Chinese that Russia is not a complete vassal yet. It does have an independent nuclear armament. So the symbolism of this act, I think, is actually rather important, and maybe it reflects Russia's weakness in the current circumstances as opposed to its strengths. Rather than being a full-throated partner, there is a suspicion that Xi may view Putin as a troublesome ally, and Putin may also be looking over his shoulder at Xi as a potential threat. And as the cameras pan away from those nuclear attaché cases, we're going to leave that topic parked. It is extremely distasteful, but we cover it in this episode because of its strategic importance and the way Russia is using it to try and win the war through terroristic threat when it is incapable of winning the war in a straight fight on the battlefield. And here is a very important, I think, opinion piece taken from the Moscow Times. This is dated yesterday, which would be Friday the 10th, and it's written by Boris Bondarev. Now, some of you will recall he's been on the channel last year. He was the first and possibly one of the only senior diplomats from the Russian diplomatic service who actually defected and has taken the brave step of continually speaking out against Putin's war. That undoubtedly makes him a target for recrimination. So he is taking a risk. Now, whether you agree with everything he writes or not, I still believe that if we had more Russians speaking out, then we wouldn't have such a problem as we do now. He's written this very powerful headlined article in the Moscow Times where it says, "Stalemate in Ukraine is the hesitant West's fault." Now, recently I've had conversations with quite a few influential Ukrainian, Western, and indeed Russian oppositionists, and they all echo this sentiment. They are dumbfounded as to why we are holding back, as to why we are afraid of inflicting a decisive victory on Russia. And he makes this case forcefully here. And we've seen this case also made very forcefully recently in articles by Jake McGlynn, including one in CNN, which he wrote this week. I will post a link to that, and I will separately cover it in another episode. But let's focus on Boris's article here. And he states, this sad situation has not come as a surprise to anyone following the course of the war. The Ukrainian army learned a lot and achieved impressive victories in 2022. Since then, they have been unable to repeat the successes. And by successes, he means the large-scale movement operations that we saw around Kharkiv, Kherson, and the retaking of vast swathes of territory. To a large extent, he writes, the problem lies in the chronic under-equipping of the Ukrainian armed forces, which stems from the indecisiveness and often cowardice of Kiev's Western partners to supply the desperately needed arms and equipment. Well, many of us say, well, hang on a second, Ukraine's receiving huge amounts of material, huge amounts of resources. How can you say that's a little? And the article makes the point. Yes, a lot has been provided, but it's been provided with a particular strategic purpose. That strategic purpose is not to inflict a decisive defeat on Russia. It's not for Ukraine to achieve a swift and overwhelming victory. Arms have been supplied explicitly, it seems, to moderate and limit the victory which Ukraine can achieve. Whether that's out of fear of nuclear reprisal, whether that's out of fear of someone worse coming after Putin, although it has been very cogently argued that that is a fairly absurd argument, and you can't really get much worse than Putin, or whether it's out of fear of the collapse of the Russian Federation, again, which is an eventuality which is relatively unlikely. It does seem that the supply of munitions, even at the scales they are clearly far, far from the volumes and the lethal capability required for Ukraine to regain the war of movement. Again, this has been gone into in quite a lot of detail in an excellent article by Valery Zaluzhny that was published in The Economist, and we will be doing a separate episode on that theme in the coming week as well. And this strategy is dangerous for many, many reasons. Fundamentally, it misunderstands Putin's worldview, explains Boris Bondarev. Putin's ideal world is one of war of all against all, where might makes right and powerful nations form spheres of influence, ensconcing themselves within an entourage of satellite states, rather than a community of democracies or even transitional democracies collaborating on a global system of laws and trade. Putin's concept of multipolarity is a world where states are competing in a Darwinian struggle where only the strongest emerge and dominate their spheres. And not just dominate their spheres, but leverage their spheres, leech off their spheres. This is a parasitic view of world power, a parasitic view of global politics, diplomacy, and the exertion of influence. What the Western leaders do not seem to understand is that that worldview is the absolute antithesis of the post-world order that was built up by the victorious Allies after World War II. That world order, partially bought into even by the USSR, we must remember, and huge amounts of trade went on, even at the height of the Cold War, with supply of foodstuffs, etc., into the Eastern Bloc. What we see now is a decisive break from the post-world order. But, Boris explains, the danger, the perniciousness, the vileness of this idea is not something we have got to grips with. It's not something we are planning on defeating or holding in check. It's something we are letting rampant, whether that's through complacency, hubris, fear, or ignorance. We risk our own values being overwhelmed by this new and barbaric concept, which is emerging from the Russian world. Well, there's a long article. I won't go through all of it, but I highly recommend you read it end to end. It's an absolutely intriguing view on what Russia's vision for the world is, and of course, it is truly terrifying. On a slightly more positive note this week, it was announced that Ukraine has moved one step closer to joining the EU. This is an article from the Kiev Independent, and this is dated November the 9th. The European Commission's historic decision on November the 8th has recommended formal talks on Ukraine's EU membership after it has cleared a number of the initial hurdles. But it must be remembered that there are still many political hurdles, reforms, and years of negotiation still ahead before the country can fully be merged with the bloc. That final step of joining the EU may well be contingent on either a frozen conflict without a hot war still going on, or a Ukrainian victory. So whereas this is clearly a significant and much welcome step, there is still a lot of hard work to go. The question, however, I think in everyone's minds, especially if they're a slightly cynical turn of mind, as I have certainly become, is that even if Ukraine joins the EU, does that mean Europe would rise up to the defense, the military defense of Ukraine, if it was invaded again at some future point after its accession? That is going to be the main question of deterrence over the next 10 years. Will Europe and NATO enforce its alliances, protect its alliances and allies, and will it put boots on the ground in defense of countries like Ukraine and Moldova if they were to come under any future threat from Russia? And this is where the lessons of the full-scale Ukraine war need to be learned. If Russia believed that we would do that, Likely, it would not invade. Russia is a bully. It is not suicidal, despite all the evidence of its actions in this war. They have come from miscalculations and a misreading of, it has to be said, a weak and vacillating West. But there's lots of additional detail in here. Do read the rest of the article about what the next stages of European accession look like for Ukraine and what hurdles it has to jump through. And also this week, it's interesting that words like stalemate, frozen conflict, and the discussion around relaunching some kind of negotiation or peace talks have reared their heads from multiple sides. That includes within Russia and the West, and it comes at the same time as the nuclear threats. But on the ground, it is not absolutely clear at all that Ukraine is not making success. And here is an interesting article from the Kiev Independent. Ukrainians step up efforts to cross the Dnipro, tie up Russian forces in Kherson Oblast. Pressure is mounting on Russian forces across the Dnipro River in Kherson Oblast. Ukrainian forces have reportedly stepped up their attacks on Russian positions to try and secure a beachhead and bring heavy armor into the fight. Now, this could be an incredibly decisive action. If successful, it could open up a whole other front to attack Russia and reintroduce the idea of a movement war unencumbered by the vast minefields, dugouts, trenches, and so on, which have, to an extent, brought the Southern Front to a standstill. We also must remember the incredible attacks on Russian shipping, including the missile carrier in Crimea, and there have been further attacks on Russian ships this week. Far from a stalemate, there's an incredible amount of action going on. Russia is losing a vast amount of armor and men and equipment in Avdiivka, in their pointless assault on that territory, with single file columns attacking in broad daylight and getting wiped out. To say it's stalemate implies failure. To say stalemate implies nothing's happening. Beneath that superficial picture, which the media paints, there is an extraordinary amount of action, and a lot of it does seem to be going in Ukraine's favor. And another story in the Kiev Independent, here we come back again to the issue with the West not enforcing red lines, not following up on its promises, not delivering on the promised arms supplies. And this is one of the reasons that that so-called stalemate is being talked about. This article from November the 11th states that the EU is unlikely to deliver 1 million artillery shells to Ukraine by March 24, media reports. The EU believes it's unlikely to deliver all of the pledged million artillery shells to Ukraine by March, and the target for that was March 2024, Bloomberg reports, citing undisclosed sources. According to the plan approved by the EU this March, the bloc would provide Ukraine with 1 million shells within the span of a year. The first step of the program involved reimbursing supplies from member states' own stocks. The second stage was joint purchase of new munitions. That, of course, also implies ramping up production, potentially creating new facilities and factories. That, as Ben Hodges and others, Gustav Gresil, this week on the channel have pointed out, is not a quick or simple process. Also, companies will not invest in large-scale production unless they think there will be future orders years hence, and they can make that profitable. With deadlines slipping and with European, in fact, Western allies generally showing an unwillingness to follow through on all their promises, an unwillingness to categorically state they will be investing in this, it's unsurprising that private manufacturers may also not invest in the production capacity because they cannot be assured of the appropriate scale and value of future contracts. The article states some of the members have been reluctant to reveal details of their supply efforts, and the EU may have to ask them to provide more information. Various issues around the supply of shells are now being discussed at the level of EU defence ministers, with a meeting set to take place in the coming week. The bloc's plan to ramp up shell production to boost Ukraine's artillery capabilities has been plagued by bureaucracy and protectionism of individual countries, an investigation by the Kiev Independent and its partners revealed. Ukraine's need for munition supplies has become ever more pressing as Russia is boosting its defense budget for 2024 substantially and was reportedly able to secure over 1 million shells from North Korea, while political infighting in Washington has caused cutbacks in the US military support for Kiev. Well, this is a worrying scenario. And again, all of these issues, all of these failures to deliver on promise, these are what are providing Putin with hope. Hope that he can hold out, hope that he can win, hope that he can cling on for another couple of years, burning up Russian lives and material, because he believes the West will fold first. He believes that our will not be sufficient to defend our values. This is an incredibly dangerous situation. And as we've said in other episodes, the cost of resisting Russian aggression will only rise month on month, year on year, if it's not tackled now. And here's a couple of articles that point the way perhaps to future episodes. I'll just briefly touch on them. They do contain some sort of disturbing but thought-provoking ideas. This one from the Kiev Independent. A poll shows that 44% of Ukrainians have war zone experience. That would either be directly at the front or the experience of being under bombardment by drones, artillery, missiles, etc. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has led to 44% of Ukrainians experience being in their country's combat zone, according to a survey published by the Ukrainian polling NGO Writing on November the 10th. For February 2022, 18% of the population had experience of being in an area considered to be the war zone. Of that number, 6.7 had been in the combat zone in a non-civilian context. As of October 2023, the number of the civilian population who have combat zone experience rose to 18% of the population. The number of those people actively participating in the fighting as combatants rose from 2.8% during the Long War to 6.6% after the full-scale invasion. And those who are in the combat zone to assist the military rose from 3.9% of the population to 11.4%. When you take these numbers together, this is a huge number of people who are exposed to trauma, suffering, and terrible experiences. And this really must make people think about the scale of trauma, loss, and pain that Russia is inflicting on tens and tens of millions of people. And that is a crime Russia must be held to account for. Another interesting story from the Kiev Independent that does not shy away from criticizing its own government, and that is that investigations have shown that authorities have not yet seized the assets of Putin's right-hand man, Viktor Medvedchuk, who we know essentially was Russia's asset in Ukraine and was rumored to be one of the people who could take over when Russia believed it would decapitate the Kiev regime. Officials have yet to confiscate the valuable assets of Viktor Medvedchuk, a former Ukrainian politician and oligarch who is widely believed to be Russian dictator Vladimir Putin's right-hand man in Ukraine, according to Ukrainian investigative outlet Bihus.info. Despite being under severe sanctions and having fled, of course, to Moscow, Medvedchuk, both personally and through his wife, Oksana Marchenko, still owns vast assets in Ukraine, including 2 mansions in Kiev, a spa hotel in Ivano-Frankivsk Oblast, and a summer house in the Carpathian Mountains, according to this investigative report. According to the report, Medvedchuk's assets could be seized by anti-corruption court through a simplified procedure, since Ukraine sanctions him and his wife. But they are waiting for criminal proceedings against Medvedchuk to be resolved in order to seize any of his property. Now, there's a lot of detail in here, but it does create a picture that not only in the West is not everything being done to sanction Russia, but even in Ukraine, not everything is yet being done to pursue Moscow's assets and agents that were embedded for many years in that society to undermine it and promote Moscow's interests. The article concludes that there needs to be more of a sense of urgency in tackling these details because they have multiple effects. They show that the judiciary, civil society is working. Also, they can provide a morale boost to Ukrainians who are suffering and who are donating and contributing so much to their country's victory. And it must be galling to see people like Medvedchuk go partially unpunished, despite their collaborations with the aggressor. And the last story here from the Moscow Times, and this is disturbing. And we will be covering stories about Wagner and Wagnerites returning to Russia in more detail. But this one is about the Kremlin saying that convicts fighting in Ukraine are atoning for their crimes with blood. When you dig into it, this is a deeply disturbing concept. And it tells you about the moral vacuum at the heart of the Russian world. Russian prisoners sent to fight in Ukraine are atoning for their crimes with blood, the Kremlin spokesman said Friday, answering questions about controversial pardon of a man who brutally murdered his ex-girlfriend. Tens of thousands of Russians convicted of violent crimes, including murder and rape, have been recruited to fight in Ukraine. They've been offered pardons and released from prison after serving on the front lines. But let's think about that. Let's think about the extraordinary concept of being pardoned for a vicious crime because you've committed more vicious crimes. The utter perversion of this system and set of values needs to be laid bare. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov defended the policy after reports that Vladislav Kanyus, a man sentenced to 17 years in a maximum security prison for the murder of his ex-girlfriend, was freed after fighting in Ukraine. This individual apparently had inflicted 111 individual injuries to his ex-partner, a 23-year-old, in an hours-long attack described as torture. Those convicted, including for serious crimes, are atoning with blood for their crime on the battlefield, Peskov told reporters. They are atoning with blood in storm brigades, under bullets and under artillery fire. Russia has likely recruited some 100,000 people from prisons to fight in Ukraine, according to estimates by Olga Romanova, the head of an independent prisoner rights group. Local Russian media outlets have reported several instances of released prisoners going on to commit serious offences, including murder, after they have finished their military service. Well, this is disturbing enough, but it builds a picture of a terrible future legacy of criminality, insecurity, murder, and fear as these troops drift back to their old communities. And this is what we're going to be covering in the next Silicon Bites. It is the legacy of this war in Russia. It will be the criminal legacy that will be felt in towns and villages across the country. We will also, in the next episode, coming in a few days, look at the conscripts, because ironically, conscripts are not being let out of the fighting zone, the combat zone, not being let back to Russia, but some of the Wagnerites and some of these criminals who've done their time are being let back. And it's an extraordinarily perverse situation. And the next Silicon Bites, we will unpack it in more detail.